Crossroads.
I couldn't decide if I wanted to start with scripture or a comedian. So I'm going with a comedian because I'm at front of the church. So why would you start with scripture? I'm kidding. No, this is and this is before my time, but there was a Jewish comedian, Jackie Mason. Does somebody recognize that name? He once said this very self-deprecatingly about the Jews. He said, "The Jews are just like everyone else, only more so." And I just about the women that we work with.
Sorry.
Okay. I always say, they're just like everyone else. Sometimes only more so, right? And so what I mean by that is they're not really a different breed, and you guys know that. For instance, I have struggled with mental health, my own mental health. I've been on antidepressants and whatnot, and my journey has been kind of like this. And just like the women at prison, only they're more so, like theirs have been like this. And their mental illness has gotten them into serious trouble. Mine almost got me into serious trouble, but I was able to take some steps to mitigate and treat that. Same thing with addiction. I've struggled with alcoholism myself, and I have probably broken the law. I'm being recorded here, aren't I? So I won't say any more about that, but so many of them struggle with addiction, only more so, right? So mine was like this, and theirs has been like that. So I thought I'd share a couple of things that surprised me. Maybe they would surprise you, maybe they wouldn't. as a way of sort of illustrating this point that the women that I work with in the prison are just like everyone else, only more so. My first night inside the prison, I was standing in the sacred place. I was nervous, I didn't really know what I was doing or how I was handling myself, but I'm standing there welcoming these women who are coming in for worship. And all of a sudden, this woman's standing in front of me and she's like, "Well, Paul Witmer, how the hell are you?" I'm like, "What? What's happening right now?" She's like, "You don't recognize me, do you?" And I'm like, "Help me out here." And well, she had been a member of my church in Indianola, Crossroads, United Church of Christ, 10 years before, almost 15 years prior to me seeing her standing there in the prison. She was a single mother at the time. I was very public about my recovery at that time, and she knew that I was in recovery. I knew that she was in recovery, and so we had just a pastoral relationship. But here we were 10 years later, and she's in prison because of her addiction. She gives me an update on her son, who I knew and loved, and he was her rock. She described him as her rock. He was clean and sober, and she wasn't, but she was getting that way. She was getting a degree now that she was finishing her school, now that she was in prison. So that was amazing. It was a wonderful surprise. Like, I had no idea I would see somebody from church in prison. I see people from prison in church all the time. And more, I realize that every time I visit a church, I meet somebody whose cousin or uncle or son or daughter is in prison. And so it's way more common than I thought. That surprised me. Which brings me to my second surprise. We were in a small group in our ministry, Women at the Well. We for a while there, we had these small group ministries, and we were doing some discussion. And this woman's telling me about her, growing up in the Des Moines area, and she starts talking about her church that she went to, and it's like, I had been at Central Pres for many years as a youth director, and gosh, this is sounding all familiar. And then she said the thing that really surprised me. She's like, "Yeah, I went to Roosevelt High School. I was on the synchronized swimming team." Now, this is not who I think of as the pipeline to prison. Doesn't usually go through the Roosevelt synchronized swim team, right? I mean, I had these ideas, but there she was. And again, it probably was substance abuse that entered her there. But it just surprised me, right? From synchronized swimming to prison. And the last one, since I'm here at Plymouth, and this was in the last couple of months, I met this woman at the Fresh Start Center. Fresh Start is a work release here in Des Moines. It's the one thing that we're doing right now that's in person. I'll say more about that. But so it's a 48-bed facility. Women leave prison or jail, and they come there as it's transitional housing. It's work release, which means they have to work. They pay their rent there by having a job. And anyway, she's there. She comes to this small group that we have, which is a kind of part Bible study, part support group, and re-entry focused conversation to help them. And she starts talking about her church. I'm like, this sounds really familiar. Well, she's talking about Plymouth Church, and she's talking about her time in Matins. And then she tells me who her grandmother is. And if I said her name right now, I know this woman. I was at her funeral. And it just surprises me that this is the woman who's sitting in front of me as a federal prisoner on release. So you just never know, right? They're just like us, only more so, because their problems tend to be heavier, or they didn't have the resources to deal with them that I had. So there's some privilege involved there. But these people are not. Matins and synchronized swimming at Roosevelt. This tells you upper middle class people. But still, these. I'm just going to say the disease of incarceration, because there is some disease sort of with it. Let me explain that. But before I do that, let me just say more about Women at the Well. And I mentioned, so in March of 2020, when COVID shut the world down, it shut the prison down too. So nobody could go in and out of that prison other than staff. And we at the time were not staff status. We were yellow badge volunteers. We had 2 pastors on staff. It was Pastor Lee Schott and myself. And we would go in and out of there every week. But when COVID came, the doors locked. They couldn't have visitors, so their families stopped coming. Think of the isolation that the women inside that prison felt during the long haul of the COVID pandemic. Now, it was probably summer when they were able to start having family visits again. They instigated video family visits, so that was good. That was a positive that sort of came, because there are families that would have to travel hours to come for a visit, and now they were doing video visits. So that actually was an improvement for some of them to be able to talk with their families on video. That wasn't available to us, so I could not do video interactive ministry or pastoral care with the women. We're just locked out. And when I say we, I mean all volunteer activities, AA, NA, book groups. There were book groups that were meeting in the prison. There's Lions Club or Kiwanis or Toastmasters, all of it. And then religious services, right? We weren't the only church that was having church there and worship there, but the Baptists and the Catholics, nobody could come in and out. And that is true to this day. We are still locked out. I think an update I would share about that is that today it's not so much because of COVID, but it's because of the double murder at Anamosa. You guys remember this in the last year? There were 2 staff members who were killed. It was a horrible situation. The Department of Corrections looks at that and does a reset. They do a safety protocol, a safety audit, security audit. They put in place new protocols. So now if for Yellow Badge volunteers to be in there offering programming, they want to have a staff member who's always going to be in the building when you're there. It used to be they would unlock the building for us. We could have the place for hours, and we could be trusted. The women trusted us. We trusted. It was just that. I'm told those days are gone. So now they have a staff situation because that is one of the things from the pandemic and COVID. The Great Resignation hit the prison industry as well. So people just walked away from that job and aren't coming back. It's very difficult for them to hire these entry-level jobs, to have correctional officers. So you have fewer staff, and now there's higher staff demand because they want staff to be there to supervise us. So that is not a good combination for us. So we are unable to be there. And I do feel, and I get word through various connections there, the sense of isolation. I think there's a lot of mental health issues at play because of the lack of programming. So they do have, I think DMAC is there, so they are able to take classes. Their family visits have resumed. That's about it. So from having a full week of programming that was available to them to basically nothing, I think is a drastic change for them. So let me say a word about Women at the Well and the model that we have. The model that Women at the Well was founded on 16 years ago is called Prison Congregations of America, and this is a nationwide group. It was actually founded by a Lutheran pastor who had this vision of doing prison ministry differently. So a lot of places take ministry to the prison. He wanted to go into the prison and start churches. So you actually go into a prison, you get the folks who live there to tell you, what does church look like to you? If you could have your own church, what would it look like? So it's very empowering, it's very collaborative. It gives voice and choice to people who have none. For most of that has been taken away from them by the Department of Corrections. So it's very empowering, and I just believe in it strongly. I'm very much so. There's a woman in there, she's a lifer, she's a lifelong Catholic. She comes to us and she says, the Methodists give us dignity. The Methodists gave us dignity. By just coming in there, asking them what you would want church to look like. She's still a lifelong Catholic, but she comes to Women at the Well. She's a very active member of our church. And that, in one sentence, is what Prison Congregations of America is to me. It gives dignity to people. And so there are prison congregations, there are Methodists, there are Disciples, there are a lot of Lutherans because it was started by a Lutheran pastor. There's Reformed Church. I have a colleague, he's at the Newton Correctional Institute. And he's Christian Church Reformed, CRC. There's RCA, which is Reformed Church of America. There's both of those prison congregations. He's got a congregation at the men's prison in Newton, and he's been locked out as well. That's true of all of Iowa. That's not true across the country. I just got together a couple weeks ago with prison congregation pastors from other states, South Dakota, Utah, Wisconsin, Florida. These people are back in. Some of them were never out. So it breaks my heart to be around them. It's like, oh, you get to see people and minister to people. I remember when I used to do that. Anyway, we just are dealing with what we have to deal with. In the last month, so September, the prison did reach out to us and say, and when I say us, they reached out to all religious volunteers, people who were offering religious services before, 2 years ago, before the pandemic. Can you produce a video worship that we could show inside the prison for the women? And the chaplain, there is a part-time chaplain there. She invites women up to the sacred place. And so we've been producing these videos, and then I just heard this week for the first time, after a month of doing this, the wheels turn slowly, and she finally has had the women in there. She says they're very grateful to hear your voice again and to see your face. And so they show a video of us doing worship out here in a church. And that's as good as it gets right now. That's the best we can do. But it's something. So we are providing this video worship service that the women can see. Hopefully I think she's going to set it up on a regular schedule. We used to be there every Thursday night. We would have worship in person. I'm hoping when we get back in that's what we'll be able to do, is to do weekly worship again. We had other ministries that happen in there. We have a reentry workshop. So when you start working with women in prison, you do start to care about what happens when they leave prison. And 90% of people, and that's not just women, but 90% of people in prison will leave and come back to their home community. So reentry is why I was hired in the first place, and still is very much at the heart of what I do, because it's something I'm still able to do with these women at Fresh Start, with women who are leaving prison, helping them get connected to a reentry team. Some folks, I have got reentry team people here who have done this work before and are doing it now. Connecting them with these some folks outside who could just walk with them, right? They don't do for them or pay their bills or anything, but they're there for emotional, relational support, faith formation, goal setting, mentoring, and that's just a huge part of what we used to do. So we would have this reentry workshop on a Wednesday afternoon. Gosh, we would have 45 women come. It was hugely popular. And we had a 12-week sort of course of study, a curriculum that we would cover, relationships and recovery and forgiveness. There's a lot of work around forgiveness that needs to be done. Just very meaningful, transformative work as they think about developing their own plan for what life is going to be like when they leave. One of the most beautiful things about that, we would have them put together a reentry plan, and they would have to share it and present it to the rest of their peers. And we had this woman, she was staying, it was just classic. She's starting to talk about, yeah, when I get out, I'm gonna connect, I'm gonna probably move in with my boyfriend and blah, blah, blah. And she's like, and you can see the people out, some of her sisters out here shifting. It's like, wait a minute, what? And they're calling her on this BS right here. And you can just see the wheels turning in her head. And it's like, I could have done that. I could say, hey, that's not a good idea. But for one of her sisters to say, hey, this is obviously not a good idea, right? You used to use with him. He was part of the problem. What are you talking? And you could just see, it's like, yeah. And she said, as I was saying it out loud, I could tell it wasn't a good idea. And it's like, but anyway, it was just beautiful that there was a lot of peer accountability that was happening there. That, if one of the pastors says, hey, that's not a good idea, it's not going to carry the same weight as one of her sisters who knows the system and what this what these, the landscape and the landmines of relationships when you leave prison, what that looks like. So that was a beautiful thing to witness, and really glad to be a part of that. I was going to throw some numbers at you. I was starting to talk about the mental health and sort of the connections there. So these numbers I find kind of staggering. So, and this is specific to the women's prison in Mitchellville. And these are Iowa numbers, these are Mitchellville numbers. 75% of the women there's 700 women roughly. There's there's outside the fence as a minimal live out, sort of like a minimum security prison that has 125 beds, and there's about 600 inside. 75% of them have a mental illness diagnosis. Okay, 75%. 85% have a substance abuse diagnosis. A lot of those are going to be double dipped, right? Their mental health and their substance abuse. We call that dual diagnosis. We did when I was in treatment. So a lot of them, they're actually self-medicating their mental illness. That's why those two things kind of go together. 95% of the women in that prison are survivors of trauma. Violence, sexual assault, domestic violence. I've heard that number, it's a little different. So here's justice-involved women. I heard that. I thought that was an interesting phrase. Justice-involved women. So that means women who are in the system, like these women at Fresh Start, right? So they're not included in the 95% that I just mentioned, but there are, I think there's 20,000 women who are in supervision, right? So they're on parole or they're on probation. So they're in the system. They're in community-based corrections, like a facility like Fresh Start. So 98% of those women are survivors of trauma. I am not a mathematician, but I'm pretty sure that's almost all of them, right? 98% is pretty high. That is staggering to me. I don't know how that hits you, but so one of the things, again, one of the surprises, I guess, for me about this work is I used to think that there are criminals and there are victims, right? I mean, the criminal justice system, that's how it operates on this premise, that there are criminals and we're going to put them there, and there are victims and we're going to take care of them here. And if this person committed a crime against this person, we're going to separate them, never the two shall meet, right? But now we have all these criminals we just put over here. 98% of them are victims of assault, sexual assault. What do you do with that? So it's no longer that the prison is just full of criminals, but now it's full of people who have committed crimes. I'm not denying that they have criminal behavior, but they also are victims. You know, I've heard the warden say this. She's trying to have people understand what she's dealing with. And she gets a lot of pushback because these law and order people want them, you know, lock them up and throw away the key kind of thing. Well, you know who you're locking up are victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. So I don't know, there's just a shift that needs to happen. And the whole, you know, I could talk about restorative justice too. I mean, this idea that we're going to take care of victims and we're going to take care of criminals in as if they're two separate systems, rather than in restorative justice, right? You have the two talk to each other, right? This is what you did to harm me. And, you know, this person's like, I can see I did that, and ask for forgiveness. One of the women I used to work with on a weekly basis, she would come to worship out in Y. It's a very small, intimate, you know, 9 or 10 women are there. And every week she filled out a prayer concern. She would write this thing out. And every week she would pray for her victim, her victim's family, and for forgiveness. And I had conversations with her. I didn't know about her crime. She was driving a car. She swears she wasn't impaired, but you know, her blood, there was a blood test involved, and it showed that she still had meth in her system. So, and she had her 8-year-old son, I think, in the car with her. So he watched this happen too. So a young girl on a bike pulled out in front of her. She didn't have a good reaction time. That girl died. So every week, probably every day, she's praying for that girl, for that girl's family. She has no contact, right? There's going to be a no contact order because that's how this system works. right? It's like it would be harmful for them to have exposure to her. And I don't buy that premise to begin with, because, right? So, I mean, she's seeking forgiveness. She knows the mistake that she made, whether it was meth involved or not. She knows that this child died because of her driving. And how does she make that right? And how do we do that with a system that keeps those parties separate like that? I don't think it's working very well, frankly. It's complicated, and it's certainly, there are no easy answers as to how do you make that happen. But there are places and there are programs. I'm looking at Jeannie Smith and St. Tim's out in West Des Moines, and West Des Moines Police Department has that Youth Justice Initiative, and they do great work. And I know people around here know about that too. So there are ways, right, where offenders have conversations with their victims, and then they make amends. They do restorative work to make right the wrong that was done, instead of just thinking that punishment is how we deal with that and get problems addressed. Anyway, I've taken a lot of little detours. Robin just sent me a thing from the Christian Century, thank you for that, about reentry and women after prison. And this is another number I thought was interesting, that 80% of women in prison are mothers. So that comes with a whole bunch of baggage, and what do we do with that? And how do we help them with parenting skills, and what's the impact on those children going to be? That made me remember, and I went and looked this up. In Iowa, there are 58,000 children in Iowa who have a parent who's incarcerated. What's the impact on those children, right? And that's men, and so that's parents, right? That's not just mothers. But I think it's like 8% of the population of children in Iowa have a parent incarcerated. It's one of the things that shows up on ACEs, if you're familiar with the ACEs scale, adverse childhood experiences that lead to a lifelong issue. So mental health, addiction, substance abuse, violence, and incarceration. There's a whole nother list. The list goes on. And kids who grow up in those sort of environments are going to be predisposed to be in the system, both the criminal system or the DHS system. So trying to look at that, pull the lens back and look at the big picture and see what the impact is. Again, the warden out there at ICIW, I have a love-hate relationship with her because she's been very hard to work with, but she has a very good heart for this work. She's trying to help. She wants women. I don't know what to think about this, but I'm just going to throw this out. If a woman is pregnant and she comes to prison, generally what they do is they send her to Iowa City to have the baby, and the baby goes into the system, the foster care, or to a family member, but that's going to be challenging. Well, she wants to try to create a place, and this happens in some other prisons in other states, where women can have their babies in prison. That raises all kinds of interesting questions, right? I don't know what to do with that. But I do think that this idea that we can help mothers and fathers in prison continue their parenting journey and lessen, I guess, the impact on those 58,000 children in Iowa who have a parent in prison. I guess I'm going to open it up for questions here pretty soon. Just one more thing to say about Women at the Well in particular. It's United Methodist in name. This is true with prison congregations of America in general. I have their values right here. It's biblical, it's congregational, it's relational, it's inclusive. That's a good one. And it's encouraging. So it's building up people, seeking to build up and add encouragement. So prison congregations tend to be very ecumenical, right? Someone is in prison and shows up to church. They're not really necessarily looking for denominational affiliation. But we are. I mean, we are denominational. So we're Methodist in spirit and in origin, but we're ecumenical, right? So our outside council, for example, our partner churches are Episcopalian, Lutheran, Disciples of Christ, UCC, who am I forgetting?
Presbyterian.
Baptist. We have Baptist members on our council. Anyway, and that's I just think that's the future of the church is ecumenical. And obviously, I'm preaching to the choir here at the Interfaith Alliance. So anyway, I feel like I've thrown a lot of stuff out at you. Are there questions, comments? Yeah.
If you'll raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone to you. And if you're online, please do put your questions or comments in the chat.
How can a local church here in Des Moines best support this ministry?
Ooh, good question. Well, there are a lot of ways. One, you can write a check, and support the ministry of Women at the Well. You can invite me to come. I could love to come preach. I preach in different church almost every Sunday. I'm at Aldersgate United Methodist this Sunday. I was at New Beginnings Christian Church last week. But anyway, I can come and preach and talk about this ministry. We can develop reentry support. The work that we're doing at Fresh Start Center, by the way, I didn't really elaborate on that, but we're doing that largely because of COVID, because we got locked out of the prison. Well, they would let us in there, right? It's a smaller facility. There's less COVID risk. There's less security risk. So we have face-to-face time every week with women at the Fresh Start Center. And as a result of that, I have 3 reentry applications on my desk from women that want a reentry team. I just, Jeannie Smith over at St. Tim's, they have a reentry team that's going right now with a woman who left prison after 25 years. So doing reentry work, I could come and train a small group of people that would do that. I know Plymouth has had some reentry folks. I don't know what's happened to that since I was thinking of Ben Coleman was associated with that, and he's been gone for 3 or 4 years, right? Anyway, so that's a couple of ideas. Would love to talk to you more about that.
This is just a comment. It seems to me, who decides whether or not they open and can have that? Because it seems like the governor in our state has insisted on being involved in all of things opening. I'm thinking of the public school system and dictating to people. I'm surprised she hasn't dictated that you be open.
That's a very good point. I might have to raise that with the governor the next time I'm sitting down with her, which is never, but.
That you get an audience.
Right. I do believe, so here's a couple things. The Department of Corrections, Beth Skinner, is at the central office. She's over all the prisons in Iowa. She's appointed by the governor, I think, or hired, appointed. So there's a tree of command there, but then every prison, I think, is what somebody once said, they're a fiefdom unto themselves, and it's true. The warden has a lot of say in what happens in the local prison in their own institution.
But you think superintendents do too, of schools?
Right.
But the governor only rules them.
But it's not a bad point. We could make that, I think we could make a case. I have, the executive director of Prison Congregations of America. I was on a call with her yesterday. She's like, who can we lobby in your state to get these things open? Well, maybe the governor. I do think the warden will resent being told by the governor what to do. And I'm not eager to ruffle her feathers because I feel like she's already got it in for us in a little bit. Anyway. And it's different from prison. So my colleague over at Newton, he's been asked by their volunteer coordinator to have their volunteers, their yellow badge volunteers, submit their paperwork as if they're going to start going in pretty soon. Well, that's 20 miles away from my prison, but I think they are not in the same staff shortage that we are. So I think they're going to be closer to opening than we are. So it may be that they want to open, but they can't because of the staff shortage.
Yeah, I have more of an advertisement than I do have a question. The mentor committee here at Plymouth is alive and well. Our chair is John Mathis. He's a retired prison warden, both in Newton and Fort Madison. We recently helped people coming out of Mitchellville. We got a call, I think it was a Friday, from a lady who did not have money for her first month's rent. We went around a little bit, and if she did not have that money, she would not be released from Mitchellville. She would not be admitted to the Y housing. We called an assistant pastor here, Leanne, and she arranged for the money to be sent to the Y and enable this woman to be released from prison. We work with women, men work with men. And we work with people coming out of prison from all the correction institutions in the state of Iowa. We were same as you, we got locked out of Newton. We had a group that we met with on a weekly basis. They closed it down and it's still on lockdown. We are in need of mentors, especially women. We have a committee, and you do not have to be a member of Plymouth in order to be a mentor, but we especially need women to work with women at Mitchellville. We have a waiting list.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
I'm glad to know that. So I'm going to try to remember that name, John Mathis.
Yeah, I'll talk to you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. Beth Skinner and others in the Department of Corrections love to gather data on what is being helpful, what is working to reduce recidivism and or successful reentry. Do they work with you in getting any data about how the Woman at the Well program is working?
I would have to say we haven't to this point. I don't know who we have to know who does the data, and it's very hard. It's almost like soft data, right? When you're dealing with relational, interpersonal sort of work that we do. Everybody agrees it has a huge impact. I don't know where the data and the numbers are to show that. I know it, so there's, what's his name? Doc Trulier does a lot of this work nationally. He gave these statistics once that if you're in prison and you have people on your visitors list, right, your recidivism goes down. If you have church people on your visitors list, it goes down even more. If you have a pastor on your visitors list, it goes down even more. So he has tracked that. And so like what you're doing, if you have people that are visiting those in prison from a faith community, it's huge. The impact is huge. I don't know where he got those numbers and how I could show that to Beth Skinner, because you're right. Beth Skinner came to her job through research and statistics. That's what she used to do for, I forget their title, but that's where she was at work in the central office for the Department of Corrections. So it's all evidence-based, right? That's the key word. This is evidence-based, and they change what they do every 2 or 3 years because evidence-based says we need to try this, right?
Hi, I've worked on reentry teams through Women at the Well for many, many years now. And one thing you mentioned is you said women work with women and men work with men. Our team, when I first started this, I thought that I should recruit only women because we were working with female people who were getting out of Mitchellville. And I was sort of surprised at a training I went to that there were some men there. And then through working on these reentry teams, these are small groups of people, but I have become convinced that it's really important for our teams always to have a man on these teams that work with women. And the reason I say that is because it's my experience that a lot of these women have never met a responsible man before. They don't know that that exists, that there is responsibility in the male population. So it's important for them to know that that's a possibility. And we show that by having these guys on the team who show up and who will participate and, whatever. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. Another fun thing Doc Trulier says about women in prison, you know, somebody will come up and tell them, you know, oh, my sister's in prison or my aunt's in prison. And whenever you hear someone say that their female friend is in prison, his first question is always, what's his name? Because there's always a man behind the woman who's going to prison. It's just like, that's a corollary to what you're saying, that, yeah, there's a lot of these women are in prison because of a boyfriend or, you know, yeah.
Looking around the room, any more questions? I want to go back to this idea of ACEs and trauma.
Yeah.
And I said to Bridget, when you were talking about that, I feel like our society has to go upstream and figure out how to address these core issues of poverty and abuse and other traumas. And just wondered about your thoughts on how do we do that as a society, and particularly for people who come from a faith tradition. How do we begin to address some of those? Because those numbers, if we begin to address some of those issues at those beginning stages, the issues of justice, maybe we will begin to bring some of those numbers down.
Yeah. Well, I agree. I mean, this is a good time to say, make sure you turn over the ballot and vote no. Speaking about public safety and
Guns.
what did I just see this week? That gun violence is now the larger cause of childhood death.
It's the number one, starting in 2020, it's the number one cause of death for children is gun deaths.
I mean,
In 2020 overtook car accidents.
yeah. And we have a Yellow Lodge volunteer who during the pandemic or just post-pandemic, she has started volunteering in an elementary school. And she kind of said this to me, is like, you know, I go inside the prison and I work with women here, but maybe if I start at the other end of the pipeline, maybe we can do more by volunteering at elementary schools in our cities, you know, to give that kind of positive role model and mentoring and support. So that's an inadequate answer to your question, but
That's a huge question also.
it is, yeah.
Well, that is exactly where I was gonna go with let's talk in the schools.
Yeah.
It's mentoring and mediating and getting those kids to talk with each other
Yeah.
about the issues that they.
And we have some great models for that here in Des Moines. I mean, CFOM and AKO, right? Some of the work that they do with, they've had great success in some of those settings. And this project that St. Tim's is involved with the Youth Justice Initiative, I think that's awesome. I mean, that's getting kids who are already in trouble, but it's getting them at a younger age than 19 and 20, which is when we get them.
And it's been my experience in the other end of the spectrum is that you have to find a way to convince the people of faith that there really is a problem. You know, that there are children who are suffering, that there are women that are being abused, that there are these other things happening, so that they can begin to, in their own minds, collectively want to be a part of the solution. And I was very blessed as a child to have an opportunity through my grandfather, who was a medical doctor and a disciple elder, to interact with the children and families that he provided medical services to that were not, let's see, how do I put it? They may have had a little bit different skin color than me, but they weren't really any different than me, because my grandfather hired a lady to pay off, in order for her to pay off a debt for surgery for her husband, by coming and doing laundry work for their family. And over the years, she ended up interacting with other members of the family, the children of my grandfather, my mother. She came and she taught me how to iron. But one of the things that I was blessed with is that when her daughter didn't have a babysitter, my mother didn't have any problem with her bringing the grandchildren to our house, and we got to interact with them. And I found out that they were little girls just like me who loved dolls and got aggravated at their moms and had these other kinds of issues that all kids have, no matter what the color of your skin. And so I've always been empathetic to other people's needs because I saw it in real life as a kid. So.
Mhm.
Other questions? No, we just died. Testing. It's not working.
Did we lose our mic?
Yeah.
Why don't you ask your question, I'll repeat it.
Sure. You know, back in, I think around 19, I'm a data person, I like data. Around 1970, I think we had 2,500 people in our prison. And over the last 20 years, we've really struggled to keep our population down under 9,000. Now, our state overall population has stayed the same. So that means our prison population has tripled over those time period. And with a lot of that was tough on crime laws, especially in the 80s and 90s. And, you know, it seems like we're going back to that now, that there's more ads on TV about, you know, so-and-so too soft on these bad guys, we need to get tough. What can we do to change that outlook in society so that people understand, you know, some of what you're talking about, that these are people just like us, but worse off.
Mhm. Yeah, so the question largely in a nutshell is about like tripling our prison population, just this tendency nationwide, but even here in Iowa that just compared to the 70s where we are at with our prison population is just ridiculous. And it's a very simple question. What do we do about that? Yeah, part of my, and just hearing her talk, I was like, who sets the narrative, right, for what the issues are? We have this narrative that there's these, you know, progressive elites that are teaching our kids about sex and blah blah blah. You know, all of this be very afraid of these people that are doing this work. Where is the narrative that we get to set, like common sense? What are we doing? You know, that now that gun violence has surpassed car accidents as the #1 cause of death for children. Why does that not raise concern? Like, who sets that narrative? I don't know.
Elected officials.
Hold on a second, Robin.
Thank you, Connie. I am overwhelmed and also impressed in a bad way with all of the data. And I think the data, black and white, tells a story very effectively. I'm glad to hear you use the term narrative, though, because I'm thinking that really what moves my heart and my mind is hearing a story and then another story, and maybe even hearing it from the horse's, you know. The data paints this picture, but we also need a story, and I want to hear it from him and her and her and him. How did you get there? And then how did you get there is part of the data. I mean, we can't just throw out the data because it's boring and it sells political ads. But and I don't know what I'm suggesting other other than hearing individuals' stories. You know, as you started out saying, yeah, wow, they're just like me, or that little girl is just like me. Who knew?
And to lift up again, locally, a model that works is Amos, right? I mean, that's what Amos does, isn't it? Is gets people telling stories around the tables and at coffee. Wow.
Going back a number of years, quite a number of years, Polk County had a jail across from the courthouse that they built, a new one, and it was triple in size. And there were several of us that said, if you build it, you'll fill it. Well, they did, and now they've got a prison out in Ankeny that's even much larger. You know, we constantly are building prisons when we shouldn't be. That's one of the things.
Yep.
We also have a court system that required by the legislature in many ways of imposing unbelievable expenses on people who are in prison. You know, they're charging people on Polk County $50 a day to be in jail. You know, it's ridiculous. And these,
I heard $90.
well, maybe they've gone it up, you know, inflation, whatever. But the same thing, you know, we have built prisons. Communities try to get the money so they can have a prison, so they can have a place for people to be employed. Now I understand that's a problem, but there's all kinds of problems within the system that even put people in prison to begin with.
Amen.
I agree. George, yeah.
Yeah. You know, realistically, we ought to go back like to the 1970s. You know, when the Republicans started the Southern Strategy, and you know, it's continued since then. It's you know, it's built on fear and on fear of African Americans primarily. We have Reagan and the welfare queen. However, you know, it's clear that corporates are much more on welfare than any African American person. We had Willie Horton's story, and we have you know, we also have the Democrats turning too much that way under Bill Clinton and Joe Biden with you know, being a little bit tough on crime and tough on poor people. And it's really built on fear in the American people, you know, fear of these people. And what you're doing, I think, is wonderful. What Jim is doing is wonderful. And actually, Amos has started. I mean, he's been working on the school to prison pipeline for over 20 years with Let's Talk and its own restorative justice program. So, you know, I probably shouldn't. Well, I know that Interfaith Alliance is nonpartisan, but I'm not. Vote Democrat, and that'll help a little bit. But we also need to do more than that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for the disclaimer.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is people seem to have this equation. If you do something that's a little bad, you go to jail for this long. If you do something really horrible, for longer. Or if you do something really terrible, we just kill them. And I hate that, because the correct solution to somebody who's causing trouble is not most of the time going to be prison that's going to help them. There are other things, there are other ways to do it. But our mentality is, you know, you do something bad, longer and longer. Yeah. And I'd suspect those 2% of the women that don't have trauma just don't remember it.
Exactly. I would say remember that.
Other questions or comments?
Oh, can I have the last word?
Please. Please.
Well, I sat in on this, so the governor convened a group to work on criminal justice reform, and so she handed it to, what's his name, Adam Gregg, Lieutenant Governor. He called this whole group together, and it was really impressive. I wasn't invited to the table, but I was sitting in the peanut gallery. I went to the building, I was in the room, and there's sheriffs in the room, and there's, you know, Beth Skinner was in there, there's the Department of Corrections, and there are wardens, and there are legislators in there. And there was one pastor at the table. And then, but, they're all sort of brainstorming all these, what's going to happen around reentry and around recidivism and blah, blah, blah. And this guy gets up from the peanut gallery and he's a former offender. And big booming voice, I just want to know who's going to give these people hope. That was his question. And it sounded like a theological question to me. And I'm kind of like, that's my language. I think we're doing that. I think faith, these faith communities, Women at the Well, prison congregations, mentoring groups, that's what we do, right? And I love that it's theological language that isn't even used in church sometimes, right? But thank you for reminding me, former offender, and he's giving guys jobs, and trying to give hope. And so that's the business that we're in, and I hope it's the kind of the business that we're all in, is giving hope. So. I think they did. I think he reached them with that. I don't know how that translates into public policy, but yeah.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate you being here and appreciate all the work that you do. Join us again in November. Crossroads is always the third Friday of the month. For those online, I spoke incorrectly earlier and called it different names. So anyway, glad to have everybody in the room, glad to have everybody online. Thank you so much and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
This is the microphone for that, and I forgot, because I had way too much time on my hand before I